So I'm going to answer the question you were never prepared for. Why do you go to church? Why does anybody go to church? I mean, we must be looking for something, right? And then the other question that was kind of on my mind is that why does a person choose a particular church? Like, why do you go to the one you go to? Now, I know I'm at this one, so coming to see me is reason enough to be here. I get that. But for those other unfortunate souls that may go to another church, what is it that makes a person choose a church? Is it the location? Oh, it was next to my house, so why not? I mean, that's actually why I started going back to church. Like, literally, it was so close, it was like, well, no real excuse now, you know. So highly motivated at the time, as you can gather. You know, we all think about like family tradition. You know, this is a church that our family's always gone to. You know, it might be a theology thing, right? There's a certain denomination that resonates with you. There may be a certain style of worship or preaching that resonates with you. You know, and sometimes I wonder how many times we go to church or to a particular church just out of habit. Well, 50 years ago, we went to that one, and gosh, geez, it just seemed like a lot of trouble, so we just keep going. You know, I say these things joking. They were funnier in my head than you guys heard them. So but I think those are all valid things, though, right? Is that there are a lot of reasons we go to a particular church, but there must be more. Right? My hope is there's something more, because if you look at all the reasons I gave, location, family tradition, even theology, theology matters, right? That does matter. But oftentimes it's just whatever theology we were in when we were a kid is the one we stay in, right? You know, habit. It's like, well, it's kind of the same thing. That there should be something more about church, right? There should be something more that makes it worthwhile. My hope is you're not just here out of guilt. Like, I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't go to church. You know, I was raised in a household like that, so I spent more than half my adult life not going to church. It turns out one Sunday I didn't go, and nothing happened. I'm like, wow, they've been lying to me all this time. So I could be fine if I didn't go to church. It turns out, though, that I found that I wasn't fine. It's just what God didn't smite me on the spot sort of thing, but my life kind of went in a direction that I personally didn't care for. So what I want to do is we kind of continue in this series we've been in called Community Builder, is that when I kind of talk about what I believe is the heart of the church, one of the most important aspects of church. Again, things like theology, of course those things matter. Our relationship with God absolutely matters. But a critical part of church, a critical part of life, is community. Right? In fact, the reality is that I believe that a big part of the reason that so much emotional turmoil exists today that in a level has not existed in the past is because we've lost that community connection that we find as part of a church. It's not that you can't get community anywhere else. There are places to find community, but there's something unique about the community of church. I mean, the church, historically over time, the church was a place where people of very diverse backgrounds could get together. That a person who was very wealthy might be sitting in the same pew as someone who was just getting by. Right? That inside of cities that are much more racially diverse, churches are often very racially diverse. Right? And so the idea was that we want to be part of a community where everyone's not just like us. Now in New Hampshire, you're going to be all white. You know, let's be real. You know, I mean, I checked the stats I think we're 85% white in New Hampshire, and 2020 was the first time ever that the number was below 90%. You know, so we're a white state. You know, it's just the way it is. We'll do our best, right? See, that's funny to me. That's really funny to me. You guys like it. I think I'm just going to stick to my notes, right? Yeah, it's coming off the notes that are killing me. Right? But here's my point. Putting all that stuff aside. Is I believe we are created to live in community. That we are meant to have a life that goes beyond ourselves. It even goes beyond our families, right? That we have responsibility to our families, of course. You know, and your family of choice, right? They're your family because you chose your spouse, right? You chose those sort of things. But we're meant to live lives that are much bigger than that, right? That we're meant to care for other people. Right, care for other people within the church, but also we're meant to serve our local communities, that we should be serving in the world around us, the immediate world around us. You know, the blocks and streets outside of the church. And I truly believe that we all deeply desire, even if we don't know it, we all deeply desire to be an active part of something bigger than ourselves. To believe and recognize and experience that we are an important part of something important. And that we should really be working together to do something more than we can do on our own. That we should be working together to relieve suffering. That we should be working together to point people to a relationship with God. That we should be working together to help one another remember that we are not alone. And these are the reasons I believe the church exists, when you bring all of those things together. Because the idea is that the reason we go to church, it really kind of shouldn't be one thing. You know, it should be, if there is any one thing, it's community, but community is automatically a whole bunch of things. Right? And that's what the church is meant to be. So when the church is functioning as it's supposed to, and there's a lot of examples of the church not functioning as it's supposed to, but when the church is functioning as it's supposed to, it actually gives us a road to a greater sense of wholeness. It's a place where we can find healing in our lives, because we all need healing. It's a place where we can actually build relationships. And when the church is kind of really banging on all 8 cylinders like it's supposed to, it's a place of deep purpose and meaning. There's also a place where we can find connections beyond surface connections, deeper connections, connections, of course, with God, but also connections with one another. But honestly, I think a big reason for much of the pain we experience in life is we need deeper connections with ourselves, understanding ourselves, understanding our motives, understanding the choices we make, understanding why we can continually pursue self-destructive behavior, even knowing that it's destructive. Waking up with a hangover, knowing I'm going to drink again today. Right? You know, waking up, not being able to pay your rent, and we're betting on the game again today. You're waking up and my spouse not talking to me, knowing we're going to argue again today. That there's something that we're looking for that we're struggling to find. And when the church is functioning like it's supposed to, it's the place where that can be found. And that's what we want to be as a church. That's what we want to do as a church. So these are the things I kind of want to dig on this morning. Now remember that throughout this series, we've been looking at the life of a guy named Nehemiah. Now we talked a whole bunch about Nehemiah the past few weeks, but just to kind of give you the 90-second kind of refresher of what's going on. Remember that Nehemiah is a guy who lived about 2,500 years ago, so literally about 500 years before the time of Jesus. We know about Nehemiah because we have a book in what we call the Old Testament of the Bible called Nehemiah, but that book is actually Nehemiah's journal. So it gives us this incredible insight into what was going on, what was happening at the time, but also what he was feeling, what his motives were, even some of his prayers are captured there. And so as we look through that, we can kind of follow along with the work that he's doing. And remember that the work that Nehemiah was called to was trying to repair the perimeter of his community, his home city of Jerusalem. Right? And remember that what happens is that in the time frame that Nehemiah lives in, he's part of what we call the exiled nation of Israel. And what that means is that the nation of Israel had been conquered by a foreign power. And during Nehemiah's lifetime, the foreign power is Persia. So the king of Persia is the one who rules a huge section of the world. A tiny little piece of that is the nation of Israel. And the thing is that Nehemiah was moved because his people had been suffering for a very long time. By the time we meet Nehemiah, I mentioned that this nation of Israel had been living in exile for decades. It was literally more than a century. It was upwards of like 140 years. And so for context, that would be like, the nation, the United States, being taken over by a foreign power shortly after this building was built. And us living under that all that time. This building's 160 years old. Right? They've been living that way for about 140 years. And what Nehemiah had come to learn was that the people in that town were suffering because the damage to the city was so bad. Because decades earlier, when the conquerors came in, they destroyed the perimeter of the city. They destroyed many of the buildings in the city. And they'd even destroyed the most sacred building that they had, which was the temple. So even the temple had been destroyed. And the people were kind of living in that kind of suffering. And Nehemiah wanted to kind of start to bring things back together. And remember that this is the ancient world where violence is at the heart of how things are done. So any city that did not have its perimeter intact was not going to be a safe place to live. But people were trying to live in that city, and they were dealing with all the difficulties and consequences of, roving bandits, small armies coming through and doing damage. And so Nehemiah's heart was just breaking for his community. And so he'd organized this effort to repair the perimeter of the city. Over the past few weeks, we've seen how he kind of got in position to do the work as he got there. And last week we were talking about how he started to do the work. And now he arrives. And he's starting to get people's hopes up. But the people's hopes had risen and collapsed so many times. Over the past 100+ years, there were so many times when people thought things were going to get better. And they didn't get better. And even when anything got better, it took years and years. Like the one small victory, I shouldn't say small, but the one victory that they had over that more than 100 years is eventually the temple did get rebuilt. Right? In ancient Judaism, the temple is the center of everything. But that new temple that they built was much smaller and less magnificent than the original temple. And even that had taken 20 years. Literally took 20 years to restore one building. And Nehemiah comes riding in saying, we're going to get this perimeter of the whole city back intact. And it's going to change your lives, right? It's almost like he's a pet, trying to just, for 5 low payments, sort of thing. Right? But he comes in and he says, we can do this. We can get this going. We can get things back together. And I believe we can do it quickly. If we work together, we can do more than we think we can. So how long did it take for him to restore, or for the community to restore the entire perimeter of the city? Well, Nehemiah tells us this. On October 2nd, the wall was finished. Just 52 days after we had begun. So somehow this community came together, and a project that was larger than the project that took 20 years to get done, they got done in less than 2 months. So how was that possible? How had they achieved that? Well, I think there were a few things going on. Some of the things we talked about earlier. First of all, we know that a big part of Nehemiah is that Nehemiah was a very organized person, right? So basically he had a real plan for what they were going to do. He knew what they were trying to achieve. He was able to articulate what they were trying to achieve. So he did those things. We know that he had worked very hard to be prepared. Right before they ever started, he lined up all the resources. He lined up all the permissions he needed. He lined up everything that he needed. And that was a really big part of it. And remember last week, the thing that we talked about was he was really good at closing out distractions. Right? Distractions are the things that can really shut us down. Right? So last week, remember that at one point someone wants to kind of call him away from the work, and what does he say? I'm doing great work. Why should the work stop? Right? That he stayed focused on what they were doing. He kept the people who were working on it stayed focused on what they were doing. So those are all really important things because they're very practical matters. You got to have a plan. You got to be prepared, and you got to stay focused. No breakthrough ideas there. Hopefully, no breakthrough ideas there. But there must have been more going on. I think it comes down to motivation. That as Nehemiah showed up to do this work, he was not all excited about being the man who got the work done. Everyone will remember me because I restored this perimeter of this city. I want to say my name's going to be on it. You're going to think I'm referring to someone else when I say that. I'm not. My point is that he wasn't doing it for the glory. He was doing it for something far more important. He was doing it for the people. His heart was about people. Right? That he came in wanting to make a difference in people's lives. That he wanted to invest in people for the sheer reason that he wanted people to have more than they had, to have a better life than they had, to do something more. And I think that the key part of his success is he understood something really important about people, But I think if we can understand it about ourselves and others, it changes the way we see things. It changes the way we approach things. He understood how important it is for people to have a sense of value. And that kind of comes in two forms. One thing that he understood is that we all need to know that we are valuable. In other words, that you are an important part of something important. Right? That I'm an important part of something important. That we all need to know that we are contributing in a meaningful way to something meaningful. I mean, if you look at kind of the classic issue of teenage boys being out of control and committing crimes, right? Because they're growing up in an environment where they don't have a sense of meaning, they don't have a sense of purpose. And so when they don't have that, they try to create it in kind of really unhealthy ways. And, to give you a clue, that doesn't end when you stop being a teenager, right? We can go through our lives pursuing destructive things, empty things, chasing things that we hope are going to give us a sense of being valuable that let us down over and over again. Nehemiah knew that people needed to know that they were valuable. So throughout the work, Nehemiah repeatedly reminded the people that they were working on something important, and they were an important part of that work. But our sense of value doesn't end with being valuable. Because the problem of only having the idea of being valuable, if you see all of your sense of value in what you do, what happens when you can't do that anymore? I mean, I'm 60 years old. There's a lot of things I used to be able to do that hurt a lot when I do them now. Walking around in cold weather hurts a lot more than it used to, sort of thing. So being valuable, of course we want to be valuable, but something beyond that. We also want to be valued. In other words, if someone cares about us, not because of what we can do, but just because of who we are. My relationship with my wife is not it's not tied to one of us being valuable. Right? I value her because she's her. She values me for some unknown reason, sort of thing. Right? But nonetheless, that these are things that we all need to know in our lives. That we are important to someone just because you're you. That you can be important to someone even if the things that you're doing may not totally align with what they think you should be doing. Right? That those are the things that we are all looking for in our lives. And this is a church, right? This is something that we should be doing, right? That we should have activity and work and things that we're doing that are important. And that each of us are an important part of. But we all want to know, and we should know, that when we are here together, we love one another, we care about one another. Doesn't mean we don't have struggles, doesn't mean we don't have disagreements. But we are all in this together. We all care about each other. And beyond all that, God loves you exactly as you are. And I never get tired of saying this because it's so amazing to me when I first heard it. There is literally no one in the world that God loves more than He loves you. And sometimes we can struggle with that. Like, how could He really love me? How could that really matter? How could that really be true? But this is what Jesus taught over and over again. That we are loved by God because we are a loved child of God. And so as Nehemiah did all this work, and he instilled this sense of value in people, he then brought everyone together as a community. Because we need to be in community. We need to be connected with one another. So he actually went out of his way to continually invite everyone to participate in what was going on, to participate in the work that they were doing, but also to participate in supporting one another. Because that's what community is that we're all in it together. And the thing that was so interesting was that it didn't matter who you were or what you did. You were part of this process. Right? There were some people who were the leaders, who were the highest among them. There were other people who were skilled craftsmen, people who were critical parts of doing the work. But there was lots of other people who were just part of the community. And everyone was just doing what they could. And no one was considered more valuable. No one was more or less valued based on their position. Each person did what they could. And one of the things that we see happen in that kind of community, that kind of tight, functioning community, is people began to stretch themselves, to be willing to try to do more than maybe they were comfortable with, because they knew they were not alone. They knew they had support there, that if they fell down, there was someone there to pick them up. If they failed, it didn't mean that people would look down on them for that. That people would encourage them because they tried, not put them down because they didn't quite achieve the outcome. Each person was there to help and support one another. Right? And this is what we all want in our lives. I certainly believe this is what we all need in our lives. Right? Doing our best to be an important part of something important, to know that we are loved, know that we are supported, and to be interconnected. And I believe, and I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, I believe that the reason that there is so much depression in the world now, the reason that so many of us feel directionless, the reason so many of us feel lost, the reason so many of us feel like we just don't know what tomorrow brings, the reason that self-destructive behaviors are at the highest level that we have ever known, whatever it is, whether it's drugs, whether it's drinking, whether it's abusive relationships, right? All kinds of things, all kinds of self-destructive behavior. Because I think so many of us are longing for these things, that without this, there's so much pain. So, of course, the question is that if this is happening all around us, the people who are not here, where could they go to find a place where they could feel valued, valuable, and have a community? Well, my hope is they would believe they could find it in a church. Because that's what the church is supposed to be. Right? And it's our responsibility to create that environment. But the thing is that when people drive along and they drive by and someone's having a really bad morning, most people drive by this church and a bunch of other churches and never expect to find that inside there. I mean, statistics show that most people don't really think much about the church. And when I say that, it doesn't mean that most people have negative views of the church. Most people actually have neutral or positive views of the church. But most people do not expect to find anything useful in the church. So that seems that we're going to do something about that, right? Because it's one of those, it's not that they're thinking bad about you, they just ain't thinking about you. Right? It's like most of the girls I've pursued in my life. She didn't think bad of me, she just wasn't thinking about me at all, sort of thing, right? But that's the reality of it. I looked at some, I was really fortunate to find a path to get some incredibly specific statistics about our location. I actually was able to get data on people who live within a 15-minute drive of this building. That's pretty cool, guys. Like, you know how hard it is to find that kind of information? Yeah. But I did, anyway. Only 1 out of 5 people in that range attend church regularly. And regularly is about, once a month. Right? We used to call regularly like 3 or more times a month. And then we said, well, there's not going to be anybody in that list. So we went to 2 or more times a month. Now regularly is like 1 or more times a month. You qualify as a regular churchgoer. And that's 1 in 5 people. Yet the statistics also show that the overwhelming majority have either a positive or a neutral view. It's actually a very small segment of people who have a negative view of the church. And so what it tells us is, it's not that they don't want to come here because they think it's a bad place to be. They don't come because they don't think there's anything to be found. And so, what do we need to do? Well, it's interesting that Nehemiah actually gives us a really good model for how to deal with that. Because Nehemiah was dealing with a particular challenge that we haven't talked about yet. We talked about the fact that there was a challenge to actually be allowed to go work on the city. We talked about that the first week. We had the challenge of resources. We talked about that. One of the challenges we didn't talk about was that, well, once he shows up in the city, and he says, hey, guys, let's restore the city, why would anyone listen? He needed authority in order to do that. So when the king gave him, told him he could go ahead and go work on the city, the king made him the governor of the city. Because in that environment, that's the highest ranking person over a region. So basically, the king, because he's king, can say, hey, Nehemiah's the governor now. And he had the authority to do that. And that was an important part of it. But there was some baggage that came with being the governor. Most governors have been incredibly self-interested people. And most governors have been very about what can I get out of this and what can my cronies get out of this. And one of the rights that the governor has is to impose taxes. And so Nehemiah tells us about the governors who had come before him. He says, the former governors had laid heavy burdens on the people, demanding a daily ration of food and wine, besides 40 pieces of silver. Right, so basically, when people looked at governors, they said, all they want to do is take my stuff. And in the ancient world, when you paid taxes, some of it was with money, some of it was with your crops, some of it obviously was with the wine as well. So basically, the governors would come along and say, I don't care what you need, this is what you have to give me if you want to be part of this, if you want to kind of, in their case, stay out of jail. And Nehemiah said that it went even beyond the governor themselves. He said even their assistants took advantage of the people. So basically, the governorship was all about the insiders, with those on the inside to get out of the deal. And I wonder, that sometimes people think of churches that way. It's all about the insiders and what they want. That there's no one interested in what anyone else needs. We notice that Nehemiah says that he was different. He says, because I feared God, I did not act that way. So he's always gets back to where Nehemiah put his priorities. He didn't put his priorities in his power. He didn't put his priority in his privileges. He put his priority in people. Right? He wanted to recognize that when you are in a position of maturity, of leadership, of power even, that if we're going to follow the model of Jesus, how do I say this? We don't focus on demanding our rights. We prioritize our responsibility. That Nehemiah recognized his responsibility was to the people. And as the church, that's our responsibility. Is to reach the people, not just those who are here, not just those who want to, but to actually make an effort to connect with the people who are not here. That's our responsibility. Because if you look at what's going on with Nehemiah, right? Nehemiah had a choice about how he could look at his situation. Nehemiah knew he had good intentions. But the people around him did not know he had good intentions. The people around him had always seen governors as problematic people who were insider-focused. And Nehemiah could have said, well, that's not me. That's not my fault. So I'm just going to do what I set out to do, and things will be what they're going to be. He could have done that, but the impact of his work would have been deeply restricted because no one would have really gotten on board, or at least not many people would have gotten on board. Or he could say, you know what? I'm going to do what it takes to reach people. I'm going to do what it takes to demonstrate that things are not the way they expect them to be. That there's something more going on here than it appears to be. He could decide he would do all it took to reach the people around him and build community so that people would be part of that community, knowing they are valuable and knowing they are valued. And that is the exact circumstance that the church finds itself in the time we live in. When I say the church, I mean like the big church, right? The big church in the United States specifically, but around the world, that people have looked at churches for years and said, I don't see much happening there that's much use to me. I'm not saying they're right, but that's how they see it. And so we have a choice, right? We can say, well, it's not my fault. You didn't do it. I didn't do it. This church didn't do it. So we'll just do whatever we want to do, and things will be what they're going to be. And, of course, the outcome of that would be very little impact. Right? Or we could say, it's not our fault, but it is our responsibility to do what we can to reach our community, to lift our community up, to help people to see that there is something here. First of all, to do the work to make sure there is something here, right? To continue to build on the things we've been doing these past couple of years and trying to really kind of continue to build that deepening sense of community, to create kind of more senses of impact, opportunities for impact. And to be sure that we're staying connected with one another and growing a relationship with one another, right? That we can make that choice. Because as Jesus followers, if someone puts their faith in Jesus, if you've made that decision, that is how we are to live. I mean, remember the scripture I read beforehand. The model of Jesus was he was the most entitled human being to ever exist. And he gave completely for what he has. He could have demanded everything, and his focus was on giving to others and caring for others to the point of dying on the cross to reconcile us in our relationship with God. The Apostle Paul puts it like this in another case. He says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more." I'll read that again. "For though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them." And his point here is that, I mean, the Apostle Paul is like super Christian, right? Like, if you hear, he would have an S, he has like a big C on his chest, sort of thing, right? Like, he's the guy who set the path out for us, and he viewed his relationship with God, his relationship with Christ, all that he knew, all that he learned, he viewed that as a responsibility to reach people. And so he looked at his time, he looked at his abilities, and said, how do I use these to connect with people, to draw people together, and to point people towards God? Right? That is the responsibility that we have. Right? That we are called to be the very light of the world. Right? That is literally the intention that we're given. That's the instruction that we're given. That we are here to do what we can to help people grow in their relationship with God. Right? To help support this community. You know, I don't know how many of you follow this, but, you know, our food pantry has been growing kind of steadily over the past few months. And the biggest impact on SNAP, what we used to call food stamps, doesn't even kick in until today. Today is the first day that people's food assistance begins to become cut under SNAP. And our food pantry has also already been growing steadily because so many people are struggling. And, you know, just to clarify that, many of the people who come to our food pantry work and have jobs. We have several people who come to our food pantry who work at grocery stores. Just stop and think about that for a minute. Right? And the biggest impact has just begun to happen. That we are responsible to serve our communities and support our communities. The food pantry is one way we do it. I'm always open to ideas on how we can do more of that sort of thing. Because my goal is that we see Sunday morning as a time to come together, to be energized, and to be refocused, but to recognize that our lives are meant to be doing the work of reaching into our communities, to connecting with our communities, serving our communities, and serving one another. And I will tell you that the closest relationships I tend to have in my life are with people that I do some sort of work with. Because there's something about having a shared effort and a shared desire for outcome, a shared set of responsibilities. And in serving in that together is when we get most connected with one another as well. Right? So that's what we're really kind of looking to do and to focus on. Right? Because you are important. Right? Because I want you to know that every one of you, I value every one of you here because of who you are, because you are a loved child of God. And so we want to be a place where people are seeing and finding value. Right? And I think we all have the opportunity to be a really important part of something important. Right? That if we pursue the mission that God lays out for us, as Jesus lays out for us, that we are all part of something bigger than ourselves that's really important. And whatever each of us do in pursuit of that is important. So we find a sense of being valuable in our lives. And doing that together, we do that in community. And my desire is that for all of us to live that out and to share that with those around us and do what we can to connect with those around us. That is what we're invited to do. That's what we're invited to be a part of, and that's what we are invited to share.